My ex-wife smiled when the judge gave her my company. I remember that moment very clearly. Actually, no. That's not entirely true. What I remember clearly is the smile. The rest of the room is kind of blurry now. But that smile stuck with me. Because to her, that moment meant she'd just won. 15 years of my life, handed over in a courtroom. My business partner looked like someone had just unplugged his brain. My lawyer slowly lowered her pen onto the table, like she'd just watched a car accident happen in slow motion. And Emily, my wife at the time, sat there smiling like she'd just taken the final move at a chess game. What she didn't know, what nobody in that courtroom knew, was that 3 months earlier, I had already started moving every valuable piece off the board. And by the time the judge signed the papers, the company she fought so hard to take from me wasn't the company I built anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because when people hear this story, they usually ask the same question first. Why would any man let his wife take his entire company in a divorce? Especially when that company started with 2 trucks, a rented warehouse, and about $14,000 I borrowed from my uncle. To understand that, you have to understand something about my wife, Emily, and the way she started asking questions. Not emotional questions, financial ones. At first they were small. So small I didn't think twice about them. I remember one evening about a year before the divorce. We were sitting at the kitchen table. I had my laptop open reviewing freight contracts, while Emily was across from me with a glass of wine. Out of nowhere she asked, "Who actually owns the trucks? You personally, or the company?" Now that might sound like a normal question, but here's the thing. Emily had never once asked anything about the company structure before. Not in 12 years. She knew what the business did. She knew we shipped freight across 3 states. But ownership structures? Asset distribution? That wasn't her world. Still, I answered. "The company owns them," I said without looking up from the screen. She nodded slowly. Then she asked another one. "And the warehouse lease, that's under the company too?" I remember glancing up at her then. "Yeah," I said. She took a sip of wine and nodded again. At the time, it didn't feel strange. Actually, that's not quite accurate. There was a tiny moment where something felt off, but it passed quickly. When you've been married long enough, you stop analyzing every conversation. Or at least I did. The questions kept coming over the next few months. Not constantly. Just here and there. Little things. How does the partnership with Marcus work? If you ever sold the company, how is the money split? What happens to the business if something happens to you? That last one made me pause. I remember putting my fork down during dinner and looking at her. "What do you mean something happens to me?" She shrugged. "I'm just asking." And technically, that was true. She was just asking. But looking back now, I realized something important. Those weren't random questions. They were research. I just didn't recognize it yet. The night that should have tipped me off happened about 4 months before the divorce. We were sitting in the living room. I had spreadsheets open on my laptop, reviewing our quarterly numbers. Emily was scrolling through her phone. Then she asked something that made me stop typing. "How much do you think the company is worth right now?" I gave her a rough estimate. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Wow," she said quietly. But it wasn't the reaction I expected. It wasn't pride. It wasn't excitement. It was something else. Something more like confirmation. Like she had just checked a number off a list. The conversation ended there, and stood in the hallway staring at the paperwork for a long time. Actually, I remember the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Funny what your brain notices in moments like that. Emily had already moved out while I was working late the night before. The closet upstairs was half empty. But the part that surprised me most wasn't the divorce itself. It was what she asked for. When the negotiation started, Emily didn't ask for the house. She didn't ask for the savings. She didn't even ask for half the company. She wanted all of it. Every truck, every contract, every employee. My business partner, Marcus Reed, almost exploded when he heard that. "Tell me we're fighting this," he said. My lawyer, Rachel Porter, looked at me across the conference table waiting for my answer. Everyone expected the same thing. A long legal battle. But instead, I said something nobody in that room expected. "Let her have it." Marcus stared at me. "What? Give her the company." That was the moment everyone thought I had just destroyed my own life. They didn't realize something. 3 months earlier, I had already started moving the pieces, and by the time Emily became the owner of my company, the most valuable parts of it were already gone. Marcus followed me out of the conference room before the door had even finished closing. "Daniel, what the hell was that?" His voice wasn't loud, but it had that tight edge people get when they're trying very hard not to start yelling in a hallway full of lawyers. I kept walking. The courthouse corridor smelled faintly like old carpet and burnt coffee. I remember that for some reason. Maybe because Marcus was staring at me like I'd just driven our company off a cliff. "Did you hear what she asked for in there?" he said. "I heard. And you just, what gave it to her?" I stopped near a window at the end of the hallway and looked outside for a second. Traffic moving. People crossing the street. Just a normal afternoon in the city. Marcus stepped in front of me. "Daniel." He lowered his voice even further. "That company is everything we built." He wasn't wrong. Marcus had been there almost from the beginning. Not day one, but close enough. Back when we had 3 trucks instead of 2, and the warehouse roof leaked every time it rained. Actually, now that I think about it, the roof leak came later. The first warehouse was just too small. The leaky roof was the second one. Funny the things your brain rearranges after enough years pass. Anyway, Marcus had seen the company grow the same way I had. One contract at a time. One risky expansion after another. So when Emily asked for the company in the divorce, Marcus didn't just see a legal negotiation. He saw someone trying to take 15 years of his life too. "You need to fight this," he said. "Rachel can tear that request apart. There's no way a judge hands her the entire operation." I shrugged slightly. "Maybe." He stared at me. "Maybe." I could tell he was trying to read my face. Marcus has always been good at reading people. It's part of why he's great at negotiating contracts. But that day, he couldn't read me at all. And that was intentional. "Daniel," he said again, quieter now. "This doesn't make sense." I leaned back against the window frame. "You trust me." That caught him off guard. "What kind of question is that?" "Just answer it." He frowned. "Of course I trust you." I nodded. "Then let me handle it." Marcus ran a hand through his hair and let out a slow breath. "You're scaring me a little right now." That made me smile, which, looking back, probably didn't help, because from Marcus's perspective, nothing about this situation should have been funny. And he was right about one thing. None of it made sense. At least, not yet. We stood there in silence for a few seconds. Then he said something that almost made me laugh. "You're acting like you've got some kind of plan." I didn't answer him. Instead, I looked back toward the conference room door, where Emily and her attorney were still inside finishing paperwork. Marcus followed my gaze. "You don't," he said slowly. I exhaled quietly. "Marcus, what did you do?" I shook my head slightly. "Nothing illegal." "That's not reassuring." "It shouldn't be." He crossed his arms. "Daniel." I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't trust Marcus, but because once I told him, he couldn't unknow it. And technically, the fewer people who understood what was happening, the better. Still, Marcus deserved at least part of the truth. So I said the first piece out loud. 3 months ago, I told him, I started restructuring the company. Marcus blinked. "Restructuring how?" "A few internal changes." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm giving right now." He stared at me. "You're telling me you're just casually reorganizing the business, while your wife is trying to take it in court?" I tilted my head slightly. "You said you trusted me." He let out a long breath. "Yeah," he said. "I did." The way he said it made it sound like past tense. But then something in his expression shifted. "Wait a second," he said. "What?" "The asset transfers." I stayed quiet. Marcus leaned closer. "Last quarter, you moved some equipment registrations." "That happens all the time." "Yeah," he said slowly. "But not usually all at once." I said nothing. Marcus's eyes widened a little. "You weren't just reorganizing paperwork, were you?" Again silence. That's when he finally said the sentence that told me he was starting to understand. "You started preparing for this before she filed." I didn't confirm it, but I didn't deny it either. Marcus looked back toward the conference room door again, then back at me. "You knew," he said. "Not exactly." "Then why start moving assets?" I thought about that for a second, because the honest answer wasn't as dramatic as people expect. There wasn't a smoking gun moment. No secret message. No spy-level discovery. Just small things. Questions. Patterns. And a feeling that something in my marriage had quietly changed. But there was one moment that stuck with me. Actually, I forgot to mention this earlier. About 2 weeks before the divorce papers arrived, I came home early from the office one afternoon. Emily was in the kitchen talking on the phone. She didn't hear me walk in. I only caught a few words before she noticed me. The company valuation. Yes, that's what he told me. No, I don't think he realizes. Then she turned around, saw me standing there, and hung up immediately. At the time, she said it was just a conversation with a friend. Maybe it was. But something about the way she ended that call stayed in my head, long enough that I decided to make a few quiet changes inside the company. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just adjustments, paperwork, ownership structures, the kind of things most people never notice. Marcus was still staring at me. So, when you said, "Let her have the company," he said slowly. I nodded. Yeah, you already knew what she'd actually be getting. I didn't answer, but the look on my face was probably enough. Marcus leaned back against the wall, and for the first time since the meeting started, he smiled. "Daniel," he said quietly, "what did you do?" I looked down the hallway toward the conference. Marcus kept staring at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle that only had half the pieces. "What did you move?" he asked. I pushed away from the window and started walking toward the courthouse exit. "Daniel." His footsteps followed mine. "Come on, man. You can't drop something like that and just walk away." Outside, the air felt cooler than it had that morning. The sun was low enough that the glass buildings across the street were throwing long reflections down the sidewalk. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Marcus finally broke the silence. "You moved the trucks, didn't you?" I shook my head. "No." That answer confused him. "The warehouse." "No." He frowned. "Then what exactly did you restructure?" I paused before answering, because technically, Marcus was asking the wrong question. I hadn't moved the visible parts of the company. The trucks were still registered under Archer Freight Logistics. The warehouse lease still listed the company name. The employees were still on the payroll. From the outside, nothing had changed. That part was important. "You're thinking about physical assets," I said. Marcus crossed his arms. "What else is there?" I looked at him for a second. Then I said something that made him blink. "The contracts." He tilted his head slightly. "What about them?" "That's where the real value of the company is." And that wasn't an exaggeration. People who don't run logistics businesses usually think the money is in the trucks. It's not. Trucks are expenses. Fuel, maintenance, insurance, drivers. The real value is in the contracts, distribution centers, retail suppliers, regional freight agreements. Those contracts guarantee revenue. Without them, the rest of the company is just expensive equipment sitting in a parking lot. Marcus thought about that for a second. Then his eyes narrowed. "Daniel." I didn't respond. "You didn't." I kept walking. Marcus stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. "Daniel." I turned back. "Relax. You moved the contracts." "Some of them." His mouth opened slightly. "That's the entire business." "Not all of them," I said calmly. "Most." I didn't answer. Marcus ran both hands through his hair and looked up at the sky like he was trying to process what I just said. "You moved them where?" "That's complicated." "You created another company." That one landed closer to the truth. I didn't confirm it. But again, I didn't deny it. Marcus slowly started smiling. "You sneaky son of a..." "Lower your voice," I said. A couple walking past us glanced over. Marcus leaned closer. "When did you do this?" "About 3 months ago." "Before she filed?" "Yeah." "Why?" I thought about that question. Because the truth is, I wasn't certain she was planning a divorce at the time. Not completely. But there were enough small signals that something felt wrong. That phone call in the kitchen. The questions about company ownership. The way she suddenly started asking about valuations. At first, I thought maybe she was just curious. But the pattern kept building. And eventually I decided something simple. If someone was preparing to take the company from me, they should probably understand what the company actually was. Marcus shook his head slowly. You were preparing for this. Preparing is a strong word. You restructured the entire revenue stream, not the entire thing. He stared at, because even now, years later, that number still sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. About 80%. Marcus let out a quiet whistle. 80, roughly. He leaned against a streetlight and laughed under his breath. Oh my God. What? You didn't give her the company? I did. No, he said, shaking his head. You gave her the shell. That wasn't entirely fair. The company still had trucks, employees, operational accounts, and a handful of smaller contracts. It wasn't empty, but compared to what it used to generate, it was a very different business. Actually, there's something I should explain here, because moving contracts and logistics isn't as simple as dragging files from one folder to another. Each contract is tied to a legal entity. Changing that entity requires consent, amendments, and sometimes completely new agreements, which meant the process took weeks. Quiet weeks. Weeks where Emily was still living in the house, asking questions, acting like nothing unusual was happening. And that part still bothers me a little when I think about it, because while I was restructuring the business, she was already planning the divorce. Neither of us said anything. We were both preparing, just for very different outcomes. Marcus looked back toward the courthouse. So when the judge awards her the company, I nodded. She'll technically own it. But most of the revenue is already gone. Correct. He shook his head again. You're a scary man sometimes. That's not the goal. Then what is? That question lingered between us for a moment, because the honest answer might surprise people. I wasn't trying to destroy Emily financially. I wasn't even trying to punish her. I just refused to hand over 15 years of work without thinking carefully about what she was actually asking for. Marcus pushed himself off the streetlight. So what happens next? I glanced back toward the courthouse entrance. Emily would still be inside with her lawyer, finishing the paperwork. And based on the smile she'd had in that conference room, she was probably convinced she'd just secured the most valuable asset in the entire marriage. What she didn't know yet was something very simple. The final hearing hadn't even happened, and there was still one last detail in the company structure that nobody had noticed yet. Not Marcus, not the lawyers, not even Emily, but eventually someone would. And when they did, the first person who would realize something was wrong wasn't going to be my ex-wife. It would be her accountant. The final hearing was scheduled about 6 weeks after that meeting. 6 weeks sounds like a long time. It isn't. Not when you're running a company and going through a divorce at the same time. Most of those days blurred together. Court documents, attorney calls, contract renewals, employee meetings. Life kept moving whether my marriage was ending or not. And interestingly, the business kept running just fine. Actually, that's something people misunderstand about situations like this. They imagine chaos, employees panicking, contracts collapsing. But the truth is, most of the company had no idea what was happening. Drivers were still picking up freight every morning. Dispatchers were still arguing with warehouse managers. Invoices were still being sent out. From the outside, everything looked normal. Inside, it was a little more complicated. Marcus had calmed down after our conversation outside the courthouse, but he still wasn't comfortable with the situation. He started dropping by my office more often. One afternoon he walked in, closed the door behind him, and sat down across from my desk. You know something's been bothering me, he said. That's not new. I'm serious. I leaned back in my chair. Talking to him again probably made sense. That conversation happened about 2 weeks before the final hearing. But the moment that stuck with me the most during that time happened somewhere else. Not the office, not the courthouse, the grocery store. I wish I was exaggerating. I had stopped by one evening to grab a few things. Nothing exciting. Bread, coffee, something for dinner. And halfway down the cereal aisle, I ran into Emily. We hadn't spoken in almost a month. She looked relaxed, calm, almost cheerful. For a second neither of us said anything. Then she smiled politely. Hi, Daniel. Hi. That was it. 2 people who had been married 12 years, standing awkwardly next to a display of cereal boxes. She glanced down at the items in my basket. You cooking for yourself now? Trying to. She nodded. For a moment I thought the conversation might end there. But then she said something that made me pause. You know, you could have made this harder. I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The divorce, she said. Most people fight these things. I shrugged slightly. Fighting doesn't always fix things. She studied me carefully, and there was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Almost like she was trying to figure out whether I knew something. You've been very cooperative, she said. I try. Her eyes held mine for a few seconds longer. Then she nodded once. Well, I appreciate that. And with that she grabbed a box of cereal and walked away. Actually, there's a small detail I didn't notice until later. When she turned her cart to leave, there was a folder sitting inside it. One of those thin blue legal folders. At the time, I assumed it was just more paperwork from her lawyer. But looking back now, I wonder if it contained the same thing everyone else believed. Proof that she was about to walk away from the marriage with the most valuable thing I owned. A week later, the final hearing arrived. Marcus sat beside me in the courtroom. Rachel Porter was reviewing documents quietly at the table. Across the room, Emily sat next to David Klein. She looked confident, relaxed, like someone who had already calculated the outcome. And technically she was right, because by the end of that hearing, the judge would officially award her the company. What nobody realized yet was that the real story wouldn't begin in that courtroom. It would begin about 3 weeks later, in a small accounting office, when someone started reviewing the books and realized something about the company didn't make sense. The final hearing lasted less than 40 minutes. After everything that had happened after months of paperwork, meetings, legal filings, the moment that officially ended my marriage moved faster than a lunch break. The courtroom itself was smaller than people imagine. Just a few rows of benches, a long table for the attorneys, and the judge sitting up front reviewing documents like she had done this 1,000 times before, which she probably had. Judge Sandra Whitmore barely looked up when the attorneys began summarizing the settlement terms. I sat beside Rachel Porter, my lawyer. Across the room, Emily sat with David Klein. Marcus was behind me in the gallery, and I could feel his eyes on the back of my head the entire time. David Klein stood first. He spoke calmly, professionally, outlining the agreement that had already been negotiated. The house would be sold, savings accounts divided, retirement accounts split. Then he reached the part everyone cared about. The parties have agreed, he said. That full, well, I hope things work out for you. There was a strange tone in her voice when she said it, almost like sympathy, which was ironic, because from her perspective, she had just walked away with the biggest asset in the marriage. Marcus muttered quietly behind me. Unbelievable. Emily turned and left with her attorney. And just like that, Archer Freight Logistics was no longer mine. Marcus waited until they were gone before speaking again. You realize what just happened, right? I do. You just handed your company to your ex-wife. I stood up and gathered the documents Rachel handed me. Technically, Marcus wasn't wrong. On paper, Emily now owned everything. The trucks, the warehouse lease, the company name, the payroll accounts, the contracts that still remained attached to that entity. But paper ownership doesn't always mean what people think it means. Marcus and I walked out of the courthouse together. The afternoon sun was bright enough that we both squinted for a second stepping outside. Marcus finally said what he had clearly been thinking all day. So what happens now? I looked down the street. Now, I said, she runs the company. He laughed under his breath. That's going to be interesting. Probably. Does she even know how the dispatch system works? No idea. He shook his head slowly. Well, at least this should be entertaining. Maybe. But the real moment I was waiting for wasn't going to happen at the warehouse. It wasn't going to happen with the employees. And it definitely wasn't going to happen in the courtroom. It would happen somewhere much quieter. 3 weeks later, when Emily hired an accountant to go through the company's financial records. Her name was Linda Park. And when she opened the books for the first time, she noticed something almost immediately. Something small. A pattern in the revenue statements that didn't make sense. At first, she probably thought it was a simple reporting mistake. But the deeper she looked, the more confusing it became, because most of the income streams that used to define Archer Freight Logistics were no longer there. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I stopped waking up at 5 in the morning. That had been my routine for years. Coffee, emails, dispatch reports. But technically, none of that belonged to me anymore. The first few mornings felt strange. Actually, strange isn't the right word. It was quieter than I expected. When you run a logistics company long enough, you get used to the constant noise. Phones ringing, drivers calling dispatch, warehouse managers complaining about late arrivals. Then suddenly nothing. Just silence. Marcus was the one who finally broke it. He showed up at my house one afternoon carrying 2 coffees and an expression that looked halfway between curiosity and suspicion. "You look relaxed," he said as he walked inside. "I'm sleeping better." "That's disturbing." I took the coffee. "Thanks." Marcus sat down at the kitchen table and stared at me for a few seconds. "You haven't called the warehouse once, have you?" "Nope. You're really committing to this." That was the agreement. He leaned back in the chair. "Emily came by the office yesterday." That made me pause. "Oh, yes." Marcus shook his head slowly. "You didn't just move contracts." "Correct. You moved the profit." That was closer to the truth. And the thing about profit is, it's invisible until someone starts reading the numbers, which is exactly what Linda Park had just started doing. Marcus leaned forward again. "So what happens now?" "Nothing." "What do you mean, nothing?" "The company still operates, but it's not profitable anymore. It's functional." "That's not the same thing." "No." Marcus tapped the table with his finger. "Daniel." "Yeah, she's going to figure this out." "Probably. And when she does..." He stopped talking, because he suddenly realized something. Actually, I could see the exact moment it hit him. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly. "She can't do anything about it." "Not really. Because the transfers happened before the divorce settlement." "Yes. And everything was legal." "Yes." Marcus leaned back again and stared at the ceiling. "You basically handed her a company that looks successful from the outside, but isn't generating the same revenue." He exhaled slowly. "That's brutal." I shook my head. "It's accurate." He thought about that. Then he asked a question I'd been expecting eventually. "So where did the contracts go?" I took a sip of coffee before answering. "New entity." Marcus nodded slowly. "You started another company." "Sort of. What's it called?" I hesitated for a second, not because the name mattered, but because saying it out loud felt strange. "Northridge Logistics." Marcus blinked. "That's been operating for months." "Yes. You didn't tell me." "You weren't supposed to know." "That's insulting." "It was necessary." Marcus laughed again. "I can't believe this." He shook his head. "You realize what's about to happen, right?" "Probably. Emily's accountant is going to keep digging." "Yes. And eventually she's going to figure out that most of the company's revenue contracts now belong to Northridge Logistics." "Correct." "And when Emily finds out..." He stopped talking again. I finished the sentence for him. "She's going to realize something." Marcus looked at me. "What?" "That she didn't take my company." He raised an eyebrow. "Then what did she take?" I set the coffee cup down. "The name." Marcus stared at me for a second. Then he started laughing. Not quietly this time. Full laughter. "Oh my God." "What?" "You let her win." I shrugged. "She wanted the company." "And you gave it to her." "Yes." He wiped his eyes and shook his head again. "Daniel Archer." "What?" That might be the calmest revenge story I've ever heard. I didn't correct him, because the truth is, it wasn't revenge. It was just preparation. And somewhere across town, in a small accounting office, Linda Park was probably staring at the company books, right now trying to understand why the revenue numbers didn't match the contracts Emily thought she owned. Sooner or later, Emily would ask her the same question Marcus had asked earlier. Where did the money go? And when that answer finally arrived, that smile she had in the courtroom was probably going to disappear. I didn't hear from Emily for almost 2 weeks after Marcus told me about the accountant. That silence was interesting. Not surprising, just interesting. Because when people discover something unexpected in financial records, they rarely react immediately. The first stage is usually disbelief. The second stage is verification. Accountants don't panic. They double-check. They compare documents. They trace transactions. And if Linda Park was as good as Marcus said she was, she wouldn't jump to conclusions. She'd start pulling threads, which meant it was only a matter of time. The call finally came on a Thursday afternoon. Actually, it wasn't Emily who called first. I nodded. Sounds about right. Marcus hesitated. Daniel. Yeah, I think she knows. That didn't surprise me either. Probably. Are you coming down here? I thought about it for a moment. No. You're serious? This is her company now. Marcus let out a short laugh. That's exactly what she said earlier. What do you mean? She walked into the office and said, I'd like to speak to Marcus. I own the company now. I could almost picture the scene. Emily standing there with that calm confidence she had in the courtroom. Marcus watching the whole situation unfold like someone waiting for the final act of a play. What happened next? I asked. Linda started asking about the contracts. And she asked why the largest distribution agreements weren't producing revenue. That was the moment, the thread, the one that eventually leads to everything else. Marcus continued. I told her those contracts were transferred earlier this year. To another entity. Yeah. What did Emily say? He paused. At first, nothing. That made sense, because when people hear something that contradicts what they believe, the brain usually stalls for a second. Then the questions start. Marcus went on. Linda asked to see the transfer agreements. I assume you showed her. Of course. And Marcus let out a slow breath. She read them for about 10 minutes. I waited. Then she asked a question. What question? Marcus laughed quietly. She asked, Does Mrs. Archer understand that these contracts now belong to North Ridge Logistics? I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I felt bad, just because I could picture exactly how that conversation must have gone. And Emily? I asked. Marcus answered immediately. She said that couldn't be right. Of course she did. Marcus continued. Linda explained the dates. That was the part that mattered most. Every contract amendment had been completed before the divorce filing. Every document legally filed. Every client notified. Nothing hidden. Nothing illegal. Just timing. Marcus lowered his voice slightly. Daniel. Yeah, I think that's when it hit her. How so? She asked Linda something. What? Marcus repeated the sentence slowly. If those contracts aren't part of Archer Freight anymore, then what exactly did I get? I let the silence sit for a moment. Marcus continued. Linda looked at the financial reports again. And she said something that made the room very quiet. What did she say? Marcus gave a short laugh. She said, You own the company, but most of its revenue streams were reassigned months ago. I nodded. That would do it. Marcus leaned against something on the other end of the phone. I could hear the faint noise of forklifts moving in the warehouse behind him. You should have seen Emily's face, he said. I can imagine. She thought she took the entire business. She took the company. Yeah, Marcus said, but not the engine that ran it. Exactly. The trucks were still there. The employees were still there. The office was still there. But the contracts that paid for everything, those were somewhere else now. Marcus lowered his voice even more. Daniel. Yeah, she asked one more question before she left. What was it? Marcus hesitated for a second. Then he said, She asked if you planned this. That made me smile slightly. And what did you tell her? I told her the truth. And what's that? Marcus chuckled. That you gave... Yes, I spoke with the accountant. I assumed you would. Another pause. Then she asked the question Marcus had predicted. Did you move the contracts? Straight to the point. I leaned against the counter. Yes, for most of the company's revenue. Yes. She let out a quiet breath. I see. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then she said something that caught me slightly off guard. You started doing this before I filed. It wasn't a question. More like a realization she'd already reached. That's correct. How long? About 3 months before the filing. Another silence. Then she asked something else. Why? That's the question everyone asks. Friends, Marcus, even Rachel, my attorney, eventually asked it once the whole situation settled down. Why go through all that effort instead of just fighting the divorce in court? I thought about the answer for a moment. Then I told her the truth. Because you asked for the company. That doesn't explain it. It does. She didn't respond right away. So I continued. You didn't ask for half. You asked for all of it. Yes. And that told me something. What? That you believed the company was the prize. She exhaled slowly. Wasn't it? I took a sip of coffee before answering. It was until someone decided to take it. Emily was quiet again, long enough that I thought maybe she'd hung up. But then she spoke. Linda says most of the revenue contracts belong to another company. They do. Northridge Logistics. Yes, you own that. I do. Another pause. Then she said something interesting. You planned this. Not exactly. Daniel. Her voice sharpened slightly. You created a new company, transferred the revenue contracts, and left the original company with the operational assets. I didn't correct her, because technically, that description was accurate. Yes, and you did all of this before the divorce settlement. Yes, she let out a small laugh. Not amused. More like someone realizing a complicated puzzle had finally come together. You knew. About the divorce? Yes. I hesitated. Not for certain. But you suspected. Eventually. The truth is, suspicion builds slowly. It doesn't arrive like lightning. It creeps in through small details. Conversations that feel slightly rehearsed. Questions that seem a little too specific. And phone calls that stop the moment you walk into a room. Emily spoke again. You heard me on the phone that day. That surprised me. You knew I was talking about the valuation. I heard enough. She sighed quietly. I thought you didn't notice. I didn't. Not at first. That part was important, because the story people like to imagine is that I executed some elaborate revenge plan. But the reality was simpler. I didn't start moving things because I was angry. I started moving things because something felt wrong. Emily said something then that I hadn't expected at all. You could have told me. I thought about that. Actually, that sentence stayed in my head for a long time after the call ended. You could have told me. Maybe I could have. But by the time I realized what was happening, the divorce papers were already being prepared. And more importantly, the trust that made those conversations possible had already disappeared. You asked for the company, I said again quietly. Yes. And now you have it. Emily didn't argue with that, because legally speaking it was true. Archer Freight Logistics belonged to her. The trucks, the warehouse lease, the employees, everything attached to that company name. Just not the contracts that made it profitable. After a moment she asked one last question. Are you going to rebuild the business under the new company? I looked out the window. The morning traffic was starting to pick up on the street outside. Already have. She laughed softly again. This time the sound carried something else. Recognition. Well, she said, I guess I should congratulate you. For what? For thinking ahead. I didn't respond. Because the truth is, I never saw it that way. Preparation isn't victory. It's just survival. Emily spoke one final sentence before ending the call. You know what the strange part is? What? I really thought I had one. Then the line went quiet, and that was the last real conversation we ever had. The company she fought for still exists today. Different leadership, different direction, and the employees kept their jobs, which honestly mattered more to me than the outcome of the divorce. Northridge Logistics grew faster than I expected. Actually, that part still surprises me sometimes. But every once in a while, I think back to that courtroom, to the moment the judge handed Emily the company, to that small smile she had when she thought the game was over. And I remember something important. Winning something on paper doesn't always mean you understand what you've actually won. Before I finish, let me ask you something. If someone demanded the thing you spent years building, would you fight to keep it? Or would you make sure they truly understood what they were taking? Because sometimes the smartest move isn't resistance. Sometimes it's letting people have exactly what they asked for. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far my voice travels. Sometimes the quietest move on the board changes the entire game.